that were going down ever so slightly. And then the $1.34 million was the transfer from the city, and that was the 3.1% transfer, which translated to an overall budget of an additional 4.4% when you add the state, the federal, and the local, for a total proposed budget that you have adopted as your advertised budget of 54,594,282. On the right-hand side are those things that we found as a school division and you found as a school board to be the things that we cared the most about, that we really wanted to take care of with that revenue that we had on the left-hand side. And so just as a reminder to the community, the first thing was compensation. We believed continue to believe that our employees are our most valuable asset in the City of Falls Church schools. And as a consequence, we proposed a step increase for all employees that were eligible, a 1% cost of living adjustment for all employees. And then we had a couple of things that we had to do by code. And one was we had to increase our, not by code, excuse me, we had to do just because it's how we operate. But the first was the increase in the healthcare costs. We were anticipating a healthcare increase of about $321,000. The Virginia retirement system increase, as you'll recall, was $270,000. And then there was a small life insurance premium that was going up as well. And then we looked at some investments for the future, which were just over $500,000. And those were positions. So they were the IBMYP coordinator, the English language arts pre-K coordinator to look at some of our reading programs across the system, social work, an additional social worker, looking at some contract length adjustments for people who are on 11 months that really need to be 12 months, looking at extra support at Jesse Thackeray, and then 3 custodial positions to help us with the cleaning of the new high school. That in combination with some reductions, and the reductions were equivalent of $222,000 in salary lapse, other employee benefits, and city retirement system, got us to a balanced budget. And the proposed additional expenditures for us as a school system were $2.2 or $2.3 million. On the next slide, you'll see what the guidance was. And I'm sort of walking through memory lane here a little because I want to make sure that, again, we put it in context. Is we got the guidance from the City Council in December of 3.1%. That was organic growth at the time. The funding share to the schools with respect to that 3.1% guidance was the 1.3 million that I showed you on the slide just previously. And then we talked about doing the revenue share methodology as previously had been discussed between the schools. So if there was any additional revenue beyond the guidance that we received originally, that additional revenue would be shared 50-50. And we're excited, and I know Kristen's going to talk about it in a few minutes too, but in the 2019 budget year end, there was some additional revenue that we were able to realize, roughly 390,000. And we were happy to continue being in that partnership with the City Council around that revenue share. So then that meant that the 44.5 million or 81.7% of our budget came from the general government. In our state budget, and this was the real winner this year for us, was that the governor's proposal that was released on December 17th accounted for almost 15% of our budget. And there you'll see that state aid was projected to increase $712,000, and sales tax was projected to increase $253,000. Just as a reminder, that sales tax is a statewide sales tax that's calculated. It's not just the Falls Church City sales tax. So when we see what we see happening now with the issues around sales tax, we have to remember that part of those sales tax revenues are generated based on the entire state, not just our locality. So then after they had talked about state aid and sales tax, the state budget was going to be finalized by the General Assembly in the spring and go to the governor for signature. And all of that happened, and it went to the governor for signature. But on March 13th, what happened next was, we'll all remember that Friday the 13th, Governor Northam ordered us to close our schools for a minimum of 2 weeks. On the 23rd of March, there was a statewide order to close non-essential businesses. And then on March 30th, he issued the stay-at-home order until June 10th. So a lot obviously has changed as a consequence of this coronavirus. So, so I got to tell a little bit of the history here, and as you know it, and as I know it, and I'm going to let Kristen talk a little bit about sort of where we are and what we know. And again, as she's going through this, I want to make sure that everybody understands it's still a moving target. We had a budget call this morning, not a budget call. We had an instruction call with the state superintendent, and it turned into a budget call. And what we learned in that budget call was that by close of business tomorrow or as late as Thursday morning, we should have a good bottom line number of what our state revenue is going to look like this year. They will not be doing new calculation tools. As I indicated to you in a Friday note previously, the state typically gives us calc tools, they're called, where we put in our data and it spits out a number. There just isn't going to be enough time for the state to do those calc tools for everybody, knowing that the legislature is coming back in session to begin looking at the budget. So all that being said, we'll have a better understanding of what it looks like at the state level in the next 24 to 48 hours. So Kristen, I'll turn it, Ms. Michael, I'll turn it over to you at this point.
Thank you, Dr. Noonan. So COVID-19 is impacting our local governance revenue this spring, and that's impacting both this current year budget and our next year budget, as Dr. Noonan indicated. So I'm going to start talking about this year first. A presentation was given to City Council last week where they reviewed the projected revenue shortfall for this current year, and that shortfall was between 1.7 million and 3.5 million. When we look at where that shortfall is coming from, the categories with the largest projected declines include charges for services. Those are primarily services provided through the Parks and Rec Department. Transient occupancy tax. Those are taxes paid when people stay at hotels, as well as fines and forfeitures. And then when we look at sales tax is budgeted currently at just under 5 million for the general government. And they're projecting a loss for this fiscal year of between 228,000. And then meals tax, which is budgeted for 3.5 million, they're projecting a loss anywhere between 497,000 and 822,000. So when we start to look at these tax impacts for this year and that revenue sharing agreement that we've had with our general government, our share, the school share of this loss would be between 600,000 and 1.2 million for this fiscal year. So that's just our share of those tax revenues. And as Dr. Noonan indicated, we've been working very collaboratively with our partners at the general government to discuss how we will address that shortfall. And I'll talk about our action steps to get there later on. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about the following fiscal year, FY21. So when we think of local revenue for next fiscal year, again, the general government is developing multiple scenarios that's based on the limited data that they have. And when we think of limited data, the tax collection revenue tends to lag when that revenue is collected. So often it's due on the 20th of the next month, or for schools, we're actually getting our tax revenue 2 months in arrears. So again, working collaboratively with them on the 21 budget, when they look at the revenue that they're forecasting, this slide shows the two scenarios, a moderate or a worst case. Overall, when we think of residential real estate, it's projected to be 41% of their total revenue. And then when you add the commercial portion of that property tax, it results in 59% of general government revenue overall coming from property taxes. But when you start to look at the tax categories that are being impacted in this current crisis, sales tax is 5% of the revenue, meals tax 4%, BPOL 4%, personal property tax 6%, and other taxes 4%. You can see that shortfalls in those categories is likely going to impact their overall revenue transfer to the schools based on our revenue sharing agreement. So when we look at our budget discussions that we've had so far, we've been discussing 3 scenarios that I want to walk through. The first is a level transfer with this current year. So that's looking at giving us the same amount of funding next year that we did this year. When you think about that, it's currently $16,255 per student. But when we think about next year, we're actually increasing by 37 students. So if we were to maintain that same funding per pupil, we would actually need an increase of $601,452 just to maintain at that current level. The second scenario that they've been looking at is a decrease of $500,000. That's a reduction of 1.2%. And that would reduce our per pupil funding for next year to $15,847. And that's a decrease of $408 per student. Then the last scenario that we've been looking at is a decrease of 1 million. That's a reduction of 2.3%. That would reduce our per pupil funding by $594 per student. So another way to think about this kind of worst case scenario, this reduction of $1 million, is when we look at that amount in terms of the total transfer, it's actually very similar to the transfer that we received in FY 2019. So next, when we look at the impact to the state budget, as Dr. Noonan has indicated, the governor has said that he has frozen all new expenditures, but the actual details of how that's going to be implemented have not fully been shared. So over the weekend, the governor made amendments, and those were amendments made to the budget that was adopted by the General Assembly earlier in the spring. We know that he's eliminated new funding, but VDOE is expected to share with us in the next day or two the actual impacts when we look at both benchmarking, which is a critical component in our funding increase for next year, as well as sales tax. And again, reductions in statewide sales tax impact us. So we're really interested in seeing what that projection is. And when we look also, they were proposing some policy changes. We believe additional support for students with English as a second language may remain. But the funding that decreased the number of students per counselor we're expecting to be eliminated. So when we think of the state's budget process for next year, what they're doing is they're removing some items like the funding to reduce the number of students per counselor. That's removed or completely eliminated from the process. But many other things in the budget, we expect them to change to a status of unallocated. So what unallocated means is that item remains in the budget, but it's not allocated any funding. And we believe that this methodology will really allow the state, if funding should increase later, to fund those items. So again, hopefully when we meet next week, we'll be able to give you much greater detail in terms of the state budget overall. So the last revenue category that we wanted to talk about is federal funding. Federal funding of $2 trillion was approved in terms of the stimulus funding overall. And when you look at the funding portion of that for education, it was allocated out to each state using a methodology for Title I funding. And Title I funding allocates dollars based on the number of students that are in poverty. So when we look at Virginia in total was allocated about $240 million based on that Title I methodology. And of that, 45,000 would come to Falls Church City Public Schools. When you look overall, Dr. Noonan and other superintendents have truly been advocating for changing that methodology, but they're telling us that they're going to stick with this methodology because that's what the federal government used to determine allocations. So again, as we think about helping us address this budget shortfall, the increase in funding from federal funding will be about $45,000.
Can I chime in just for a second, because you spoke about the advocacy of moving away from the Title I methodology and using the IDEA methodology that would be more adequate and more accurate with respect to the support that we're giving to students. The one last hope we have is that there is a meeting tomorrow with Dick Saslaw, and it's my understanding that Mary Beth Conley will be sharing with Senator Saslaw what our advocacy is with respect to those funds. What I'm hearing, though, from the state superintendent is that it's actually in code, and I'm surprised at that. But I did want to let you all know that we're going to try one last approach. But we did get a nice coalition of schools together. We had Loudoun County, Poquoson, and several others. So we had large and small, but we weren't able to persuade the state superintendent to move to a different methodology.
So I would like to talk now about the next steps. So we'll start with the next steps for this current year's budget. So for the current year, we're in the process of updating the projections that we'll share with you at next Thursday's work session. So I really want to reach out and thank Michelle Kopic for all of the great work that she's doing updating those projections. The methodology that we're using is collaboration with the county in terms of trying to project impacts to sales tax. Hopefully we'll have additional information from the governor. But overall, we'll be forecasting where we expect our revenue to be for this current year, as well as our expenditures.